So folks, welcome. This is going to be a really exciting conversation. There are some super interesting folks here. Lorenzo from Motherboard and Vice, Dan from the Financial Times, and Runa, who works on newsroom cybersecurity, and many other amazing projects, a lot of cool research. The conversation that we're going to have today is going to focus on a bunch of different interesting topics, focusing on the commercial surveillance industry. We're going to talk about different players, mercenary players, players who work for governments, players who work for hire. So I'm super thrilled to have all these three people here. Their bios absolutely speak for themselves, and I'd recommend that you follow them all. They're all really interesting on Twitter and the socials. The goal of our panel conversation today is to focus on this really remarkable industry. My name is John Scott-Railton. I'm a senior researcher at a place called the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. And I've spent a better part of the last decade, along with my colleagues, tracking digital threats to civil society groups. And in one way or another, my work has intersected with the work of each of these really talented people. So what I wanted to do is direct their talent and understand the state of this surveillance world, marketplace, and industry, where it's going, and the threats that it poses, not only to the world, but also to you as reporters and investigative journalists. So I thought I'd kick off by asking Lorenzo a basic question, which is, can you help us understand what this industry is and give us a little bit of a sense based on your almost decade of work at this point into the commercial surveillance industry of what the industry is?
I feel like probably the easiest way to describe the industry is to call it the government spyware as a service industry. I don't think I coined this term. Someone else has probably, but I don't remember. But the point is that we're talking about that part of the government contracting world that essentially just focuses on cybersecurity services, or more particularly surveillance services and hacking services, really. Like cybersecurity is kind of a misnomer in this sense. They don't really provide, defensive services. These are all companies that, go around trade conferences, meet with government officials and are like, hey, we know that you have a problem with, listening in on WhatsApp calls or signal or intercepting signal messages or all that kind of encrypted stuff. And we can help you by giving you services and products that help you essentially hack targets and listen in. And it's, for some people, this may be news because it's still not a hugely popular industry, but it's been going on for a long time. We're talking about probably since the beginning of the internet, really. I think in the 90s, this was more boutique kind of work, and startups, not even startups at the time. It was like, friends of cops that had like hacking prowess, and they were like, they sometimes used to get calls from their friends in the, the prosecutor office or whatever and say, hey, can you help us with this? And they would write like a malware or repurpose some sort of a open source tool. Like at the time, we're talking about Back Orifice, for example, from the Cult of the Dead Cow, which was a Windows RAT remote access tool. And then in the 2000s, this became an actual business and an actual industry when FinFisher and Hacking Team, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, came on the scene. And these are European companies. One is German/British. The other one used to be Italian. They're dead. And these two companies were really sort of the first ones that were like, okay, we can take this to an international audience. We don't have to help just our friends down the block in the Italian police or the German police or whatever. This is a service that anyone could use. And to their credit, they really conquered the world to a certain extent. I was just looking earlier at the map, but like the whole South America was basically a customer of Hacking Team. Large swaths of the Middle East bought products from FinFisher and Hacking Team, or Amesis, which used to be French. I don't even know what happened to them. Like, this is definitely a flourishing industry. And I think at this point, 20-something years in, it's pretty mature in terms of who the players are, what they offer, and what governments want from them.
Cool, that's really helpful. So let's think a little bit about who these customers are. You've mentioned governments. What kind of governments are buying this stuff? Who are the customers in those governments? And then maybe tell us also about the companies where there's overlap in customers between like private sector and government.
Yeah, so the customers, I mean, largely it's anybody who has people who use computers in their countries are potentially customers of these companies. Historically, we're talking about a lot of South American countries. The most infamous ones are Mexico. I think Panama, for example, was a huge customer of Hacking Team. And obviously Middle Eastern countries, we're talking about UAE, Morocco, which I guess it's North Africa. There was also like at some point, some Italian company that sold to Syria, I think right before the sanctions, or it actually overlapped with when the sanctions came in and they actually got slapped on the wrist with I think it was a few $1 million fine from the State Department. So unfortunately, I think the companies in this industry would like you to believe that they sell only to, Western governments or governments that have like, a solid rule of law and stuff like that. But historically, as you and your colleagues at Citizen Lab mostly have proven, that is not true. And yeah, so, there's at this point dozens of cases, well-documented, well-proven cases of abuse where, countries like Morocco, Ethiopia, UAE, Mexico have used these tools against journalists, dissidents, human rights activists. I mean, in Mexico, it was even anti-soda activists. We're really getting to a point where anyone can be a target. And yeah, I mean, all these companies have always responded to these stories with, we just provide the services. We don't know what the governments do with our tools. Also, we make them sign whatever contracts that we've never seen, by the way, that they never really showed us, that where the governments essentially promise that they're going to use these tools only for good, quote unquote. That is one of the keys. It's like, what good, whose good is this and for whom? So yeah, it's really everywhere, and we're talking about Europe too. Like Hacking Team's first ever customer outside of Italy was Spain. And this is when right after Al-Qaeda killed around 200 people in Spain with the famous 11th of March terrorist attacks. So yeah, basically anyone is a customer, and we're lucky actually that thanks to people like you, John, we know some of the customers, because these companies don't really want to tell us. They always say the list of our customers is secret. It's none of your business.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. And there are a couple interesting threads there. One that relates to what you just said about Spain is that in many cases the product enters a country with the narrative that it's going to be used to track organized crime and terror groups. And that may very well be the real motivation. But what we find as researchers is give it time. Politicians will identify that the capability exists within their government, and unless there's just a tremendous amount of oversight, it will be abused, which gets me to, you brought up soda campaigners in Mexico. They actually weren't even opposed to soda. They just wanted soda to be better taxed to reduce childhood obesity. So this is the friendliest people you can think of who cared about childhood obesity get targeted with this thing, which brings me to this other interesting point, which is not all the clients are governments. And there are some shops, and we're going to get to that in a second, where they may moonlight for governments or do some work for governments, but they also work for the private sector, which gets us to Dan. Dan McCrum and I go back a little bit for a very interesting reason, which is Dan is a target and was extensively targeted by one of these mercenary operations that we were involved in investigating. So Dan, take it away. Tell us a little bit about this story.
Yeah, so thank you, John. So to tell you a bit about the story, I need to tell you about a German company which collapsed recently this year called Wirecard. And I don't think anyone in the US has really heard of it, because it was a payment processor who did things in the background that helped, online websites take credit card payments. Pretty simple business. But it was also an enormous fraud. And so it collapsed this year. It was a member of the DAX 30 company, DAX 30, one of Germany's largest companies. It was worth about $25, $30 billion. But it turned out it was a gigantic accounting fraud, and also had been doing money laundering for various unpleasant businesses and basically all the sorts of nasty things that you might find online. And I had started writing about it back in 2015. And what we now know from our reporting is sort of in 2016, as things got a bit crazy, the company was attacked by some short sellers. One of the group's private detective agencies put together a discussion document for various tactics they could use. And it was a whole laundry list of things that they would do, looking at various people. And one of them they talked about using against me and someone else was using, I think it was called an ISI or an IMI catcher. It was basically something which masqueraded as a mobile phone mast, which they could carry around, and they would use that to try and target my cell phone directly. We don't know if they were ever successful in that, but what we do know is that there was a lot of hacking emails sent, an unbelievable amount. And we know this for various reasons, but back in about 2015, me and my colleagues started to receive these phishing emails, and some of them were quite good. They would look like LinkedIn messages. It would look like a colleague had shared a YouTube video with me. What you also had was me and friends also had photos taken from Facebook, then put into what looked like a Google album. So someone had shared like a Picasso album or something with you. They were all highly targeted emails. And these, it turned out, went not just to me and my colleagues, but also to a whole range of researchers, hedge fund managers, journalists, who, and the common thread amongst all of them, they were targeting this German company. And the reason we know for sure that this happened is because in about December 2016, a fake whistleblower popped up online. And the whistleblower had put together this whole case that me and another journalist at Reuters had been working together with some short sellers to maliciously attack Wirecard. And so they had some pictures of the short sellers taken by private detectives, and they had put that together with a whole load of actually hacked emails. Now, I don't think that they ever were successful in hacking my emails personally, because I feel like they would have used more of it, but they had certainly hacked my sources. And so we had this, it's hard to describe the sensation of when you're reading something which you think, oh, it's a load of nonsense, and suddenly you see your own emails out there in a document on the internet. And that was really successful, because it actually helped play into this narrative that the company was being maliciously targeted by short sellers. And the questions that I and others have been raising about its accounting, there was nothing to them. And that helped not just to create this impression amongst the wider world and investors, but also regulators. So the German authorities, BaFin, investigated some of these short sellers for a number of years. I had to go through an internal investigation back in 2016 based on these hacked emails. And when the FT went through them, it became clear they'd just been maliciously arranged and there was nothing to it. But last year, I was again investigated by the German authorities as part of a criminal investigation. So the man behind me, there are so many tangents to this story, I sometimes get distracted by it. But what I should have said is the man behind me in the poster, that's a genuine wanted poster put out by Interpol for the former chief operating officer of Wirecard called Jan Marsalek. And he conspired with some speculators to try and frame me and a colleague at the Financial Times for market manipulation. And when the German authorities were put together a complaint to hand to prosecutors, they referenced this document of the fake from the fake whistleblower based on the hacked emails as part of the evidence against me. And so it was incredibly effective from the company's perspective in terms of demonizing its critics and persuading the authorities that there was something there for them to look at.
It's a mad case. And I remember, we had been investigating this for a while and had worked with Dan for a couple of years as this case went on. And one of the things that really struck me is how much poison this brings into the work of a reporter, because it makes you question the security of your communications with your sources, and it disrupts your internal trust. It's an amazing story, and we're going to return to it in this conversation. But this kind of beautifully leads us to the work that Runa has done for years, which is trying to focus on and understand threats to journalists and their reporting. And I'm sure Runa is familiar with the story of Dan and the group responsible. So we found that the responsible party for a lot of this was an Indian-based hacking operation called Beltrox, whose motto is "You desire, we do." Beltrox has targeted tens of thousands around the world. And according to reports, also moonlights and does work with the Indian government, which puts them into that category of government mercenary hacking as a service. But of course, they clearly are also engaged in criminal behavior on the side, which is part of the problem of this kind of industry. Runa, Dan's case is obviously really dramatic. You've been around this for a while. Do you feel like journalists in newsrooms right now take this seriously? Has this been a journey that they've been going through? What's the status of this right now?
So I would say, yes, things are definitely getting better. I mean, I've been working with reporters for the past 9 years at this point. And early on, my sense was that digital security was something that, the view was that only certain reporters needed it. Only the reporters who wrote about cybersecurity issues needed to really think about that specific topic. But then over the years, looking at just different types of threats and how they would affect different types of reporters, I do feel like there's been a lot more that's been written about it now. People are more aware. There's a greater tie-in between newsrooms and the security teams at the companies as well. I think, I want to say 5 years ago, media organizations typically did have a security team, but that would be staffed with people who did very traditional IT security roles. So you'd have compliance, you would have security operations and triage and analysis. You may have someone doing penetration testing, but there wasn't necessarily anyone on that team that was the direct link between the newsroom and the security team, and then the newsroom and the business side of the company. And I think that is far more common now than back then, which I think has done a lot to help.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Did anything in Dan's story surprise you? I mean, I remember you and I have known each other for years, and I remember early on, when talking to reporters, you had to and reporters and their staff, you kind of had to say look, bad things could happen. Does Dan's story surprise you?
It does not. I think it's been, it is unfortunate that it happened. I will say that. I think it is great that we're able to see as much about it as we can now and talk about it and show examples. I think it just takes it one step further in showing people that this does happen. It can be really difficult to deal with. It can have really severe consequences. It can be really difficult to even detect that it's going on as well. So I think that the more examples that we have and the more examples that we get over time, the better.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, I remember my own personal frustration in the early years trying to explain to reporters that this cuts directly into the ethics of protecting your sources. And I remember that sort of sense maybe 5 or 6 years ago, only the specialized reporters, only the national security reporters really need to worry, right, about this, not those, financial journalists reporting on, German market frauds. But I think, where we're at right now is that this is an issue that's relevant to reporters for 2 reasons. First, it's relevant because this now touches almost every sector and industry, and it can touch your work, which brings us to the other thing, which is you may be a target. One of the things that we find, and Lorenzo mentioned this earlier, but like in the Citizen Lab investigations that we've run, journalists come up again and again as targets. They're like the preferred target. If there's one thing, once a government gets this kind of technology and starts using it in sloshy ways, or once a company acquires it, there's a real good chance that journalists are among the targets. So Lorenzo is like, and I'm like proud to say it, one of the best reporters who's been on this beat the longest. He knows what he's doing, and he's like really helped surface this to a whole set of readers who I think, when you started reporting on this back in the day, didn't have a clue about this stuff. So you've gotten us to a great place. But I think it was a journey for you as a reporter to cover this. And I feel like it's still a journey for any reporter who wants to sort of touch on this topic. Can you talk about some of the barriers to entry for this beat, for talking about this stuff, working on it?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, I think you're too kind. There's a lot of great reporters on this beat, like my colleague Joseph Cox and many more.
Many more, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at Forbes, Washington Post, New York Times, we've all sort of chipped in, especially in the last few years. But yeah, I definitely, when I started looking into this, 2011 or 12, it was more of a fringe. Maybe fringe is not the right word, but like a sort of like more overlooked topic. Now some of the stories that you guys have uncovered and people have written about end up on the New York Times front page and stuff like that. But at the time, it wasn't as common. And in terms of challenges, I mean, first of all, the industry is incredibly secretive by design. The companies have no interest in talking about themselves other than to vaguely market their wares and their skills. And some of them, to their credit, were pretty good at being balanced between, marketing themselves and not talking too much about themselves. Like, in fact, Hacking Team was very good at that. And they sort of like rode the wave a little bit after they got exposed to make more money, essentially. So the number one challenge is companies like Hacking Team and even more like, the Belltroxes of the world that do private work definitely don't want to talk about themselves. Their ideal scenario is no one knows who we are other than our customers. Then the other side of the industry, the customers, is also pretty secretive. If we're talking about governments, governments don't want you to know how they use tools to go after criminals. There's pretty well documented history, even in the US, where FBI or DEA or even local cops do everything they can to hide any kind of technology they used. I think Dana mentioned the IMZ catchers. I don't even know. I don't know how to pronounce it. But and that's also a story that goes back, 10 years. And some governments have argued that they have NDAs with these providers, and so even in criminal complaints and criminal, cases, they don't reveal what technology they used. So essentially, you have on both sides, the customer and the provider that don't want to talk about anything, and it's the same with the private customers, because companies don't want to get caught using probably illegal services. So that's the challenge number one, and that's kind of like that permeates all the kind of coverage that you want to do. And obviously, challenge number two, or maybe in this case even challenge number 0, is that you can become a target, just like then, which in an ideal world it shouldn't happen, but unfortunately it's happened a few times already. Like we saw it with a couple of years ago when you yourself, John, and became a target. And so, yeah, journalists are targets, human rights dissidents are targets, and those people can be our sources. So yeah, we have to be very careful. And as you said, because we don't want to end up being targets, because it just even, the embarrassment is not even that important. It's just, it becomes and we shouldn't be embarrassed, by the way, because we're victims. But it becomes like a sort of denial of service on journalism. You don't trust yourself anymore. You don't trust your phones. You don't trust your computers. You don't trust your sources. Sometimes you don't trust your partners or friends because they may be targets too.
Yeah, and it's like, so, Lorenzo mentioned that me and some of my colleagues were targeted. We were targeted by, in real life, by a group of private spies trying to find out more about our work on NSO Group. It's a story that I ended up working on with Raphael Satter, who's now at Reuters, along with some of his colleagues. And we actually caught the guys in a restaurant. But one of the things that showed me, we'd spent years working with many journalists who've been targeted. And it really highlighted to me how being targeted or suspecting that you're targeted, it's like feeling like you're contagious. You feel like you're bringing risk to the party and you don't know where your contagion begins and ends, and it changes your behavior. And I think in so many cases, it's the targeted version of what repressive regimes try to do, which is they try to convince you that they can listen to your calls and that they're all knowing, right? Since forever. You got Hun Sen in Cambodia a couple of weeks ago saying that he could listen into, encrypted phone calls. Back in the day, Gaddafi was lying and telling the population he could listen to Skype. Same drill, get into people's mindset. But this is a conversation, not a security training, but at the same time, Runa is a real expert in newsroom security and protecting reporters. For reporters who are listening to this, editors who are listening to this, what's the first thing that they need to understand about how to protect themselves if they think they may be targeted or they're poking around in this space?
I would say for the top 3 things that you should do to just be safe online, regardless of what type of work you do, is to ensure that you have strong, unique passwords on all of your online accounts, that you have 2-factor authentication turned on for all of your accounts that support it, and that you install software updates on your devices and on your phones as soon as possible. I think that if you start looking at ways in which reporters have been hacked, I would argue, I think it's safe to say that more often than not, that is done through phishing, whether that is a phishing email, if it's a link on Facebook, if it's a link in a Twitter DM, for example. Clicking that link, entering your username and your password then gives the attacker that access to your account. So having a unique password and having 2FA turned on does become the quickest, easiest, best way to secure yourself. From there, I would say, depending on the type of work that you're doing, you may want to consider different workflows or different devices. For example, if you're doing really sensitive investigative work, maybe you do need a separate laptop for that work. Maybe you do need a separate phone. Maybe you do need a little working group in the newsroom with a legal team, with a security team, with a representative from IT. You can create some laptops on the spot. I think the most important thing is just to consider that the work that you're doing may actually make you and or your colleagues a target, and from there plan on different devices, different workflows, specific ways of communicating that wouldn't necessarily just be the same old default flow, right?
That's super helpful. And it's helpful because it means that, if you're watching this, there are things that you can do right now that Runa has highlighted. I'm going to give a plug for another resource, which is called the Security Planner. You can find it by Googling it or going to securityplanner.org. We built it at the Citizen Lab. It now lives with Consumer Reports. It gives you some basic advice on how to be safe online. I think one of the challenges that we've faced, and I know, Runa, this is a conversation you and I have had, is that reporters, a lot of them by breed, tend to be, cantankerous, independent, adjectives. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that security happens. Dan, you pointed out, right? You thought, well, we're probably secure, but what about our sources, right? So security happens in groups because people get targeted in groups. And Runa, I wonder if you could speak for a moment to the sort of challenge of how to take the mindset of reporters and editors and move it from the sort of individual, here are the things that I do to stay safe, to something that's a little bit more systematic, and just talk about those challenges at the newsroom level and beyond as well.
Sure. I think it has been a bit challenging to go from having a conversation with reporters who do investigative work, who may be relatively up to date on these challenges and these threats, and understand the importance of protecting themselves and their data and their communications, and then have that same discussion with someone on the styles desk or obituaries, for example. And like, how do you even begin to communicate to that type of audience why passwords and two-factor really matter? I think in some cases it has been helpful to illustrate how targeting one individual somewhere in the newsroom could actually impact the entire newsroom and the entire business. Those examples are typically not found in the world of mercenaries and spies, but in ransomware. That's been a very great example where you can show, whether it's at a hospital, at a print plant, at a newsroom, how it only takes one individual clicking a link, running a piece of software, opening a document before the entire newsroom in the company is affected by it. And so I think that speaking to a newsroom as a whole, or to sort of a wider group of audience, just means that you need to tailor your message in a slightly different way and talk about how security matters as a community. I think that especially within newsrooms, everyone is very clear on the need to protect sources. Like, no one wants to burn a source. Everyone would rather go to prison, right, than name a source in any context. And so to then map that online, you should then take the steps that you can take that are available to you, that are very easy to do, to ensure that you're doing what you can to protect your source. But again, that type of messaging may not work for the entire newsroom and the whole audience. So it's a fun challenge.
Yeah, and it's a very multifaceted one. So Dan, you've lived through this. You were targeted not just as an individual, but as an individual, as part of a group of other reporters, but also as part of a group of people who are working on the same topic. What's your take on what Runa has sort of said?
Well, actually, I was just thinking about what you said before about the effect it has on you and the paranoia. And you reminded me, I just had a drawdown in here. I've got a laptop here, like it's an old MacBook, which I haven't used since December 2016, when the hacking stuff appeared, because we were concerned about it then. And so one of the people involved said that they thought they might have hacked my computer. And so there's stuff on there which I always want, it's just sort of sitting there until I can find a safe way to get it off it. But that you become, this paranoia takes hold. And so operating under that sense of being attacked, you sort of, you worry about family. Certainly lots of people in the Wirecard targets, spouses or family members were also targeted. And that constant sense of paranoia impedes the reporting as well. So when we were reporting on Wirecard in the last couple of years, we would never take phones into meetings with us to discuss any aspect of it, because we were paranoid they'd been hacked. And, I spent 3 months working essentially in a bunker on an off-the-grid laptop. And so you have that effect. And and part of that has helped to get the message across. And certainly I think one of the things the Financial Times realized a few years ago was that anybody could be a target, because you can get access to things like internal emails. So if you're on a news list and something is going around about, a takeover we hear might be about to happen, that's valuable information. So there have been worries about, were people trying to hack that? Or if you can get into the content management system, if you may be a journalist in the features section, but if you can get into the content management system and can see what else is happening within the paper, that would be valuable access. But we've been pushing two-factor authentication on everything for quite a long time. to the extent that it's quite hard to get anything done at the FT if you're not using 2FA. But yeah, it is. You sort of have to make that central to the whole aspect, and it's become a real challenge to to make those. I think one of the challenging aspects is when you are now first making contact with sources, because the things that make you suspicious about, can I trust this person? What are they sending me? Is this a phishing attack? But also, if you're an investigative journalist and a whistleblower is trying to get in touch with you out of the blue, they are doing the exact same things that you might be doing as a phishing attack. They're like, hey, I've got some amazing documents you should look at. Or I want to get in touch out of the blue. How are we going to communicate? So you have that sort of challenge. You can't just seal yourself off.
Yeah, and it's tricky also. Like historically, we see a fair amount of targeting. It's kind of funny. Like journalists are just front and center because a lot of targeting that we see may masquerade as a journalist, or if the journalist is the target, masquerading as a source. So, we got a little bit more time here, and I want to kind of like move this conversation into the question of like consequences for this and where we're really going with the control of this. One question that Lorenzo had recently asked me that I hadn't yet responded to was, what percentage of the targets when this stuff gets used are like legitimate targets, and what percentage are civil society would we consider abuses? And I was thinking, how do I answer that? Because from the research that we do at the lab, we mostly see people who we think of as illegitimate targets because this is who we engage with. But I think also the cases where I've looked at sort of like swaths of targeting. And for me, the more useful lens is not a global percentage, but rather to look at each user. And there are cases of countries where I would be comfortable saying 100% of what they do with it is totally illegitimate. And there are other countries where it's like, it seems like for the most part, they're using this in a way that fits, their rules and oversight, which kind of gets us to this question of who gets the software, right? So I think this kind of technology has the potential for abuse, and it's a potential that in certain situations can be mitigated by oversight and rule of law. But in other cases, it doesn't get mitigated. So it's my belief that despite certain regulatory things, the industry still functions in a mostly unregulated way. There are certain things like if I'm a developer of this stuff and I want to sell it, I may have to get permission from my Ministry of Defense to sell it to a particular country. But in many cases, that looks rubber stamp. But I just want to ask Lorenzo, who's been around this for a minute, am I wrong in basically feeling like if there is regulation, it has nowhere near the scale of impact that it would need to be considered like effective regulation? Is that right? Tell us more about what the regulations are and kind of how it's working.
Well, first of all, the short answer to that is you're right. As I said, this has been going on for a couple of decades now, and we have a lot of cases of abuse, and we haven't really seen that many cases of legitimate use. So I think at this point, first of all, the onus on proving that this industry is legitimate is on the companies that are part of the industry, and in part on the governments that use them. But yeah, to set up a little bit what the regulatory framework is, I guess you have to look at it from two sides. One side is, where the company is based. As you said, most of these companies are based in countries where there is some limitations on where you can sell. Usually it's some sort of sanctions framework or export controls framework. So the classic examples is that most countries in Europe and the Western world in general cannot export to Syria or Iran or North Korea. So that falls into this. If a French company or an Italian company wants to sell anything to any of these countries, they cannot, in theory. And if they want, they still have to go through a process where they ask for permission. But we have evidence that those processes are, as you said, a rubber stamp, essentially. Like in the case of Italy and Hacking Team, again, for many years, the way this worked was that Hacking Team had a, what was it called? It was called like a global license, which means that the Italian government essentially said, yeah, you can export wherever you want. So that's basically no control at all. There's a recent case out of Germany with FinFisher. The company has been raided, I think, a month ago by the police in Germany because they're investigating allegations of illegal export to, I think, countries like Egypt and others. So there's, unfortunately, just like in the case of victims, journalist victims and dissidents, there's a lot of cases of abuse and very few cases of success, successful regulation. The EU especially has been pushing a lot for reform on the front of export regulations, but unfortunately it just hasn't worked because it's a piecemeal, there's just a lot of, essentially every country has to buy in, every country has slightly different rules, and also every country has a temptation, I guess, to be favorable to their own industries. Like you can think about, I don't know this, but I can imagine that the Italian government back in the day was like, well, Hacking Team is a, innovative startup. We want to support them. We don't care if they sell to Mexico or UAE. And I think that the best example of what you were saying, that there's so many, we're talking about dozens at this point, cases of abuse, is that there's somebody like Ahmed Mansour, who is in jail in the UAE right now, and he's been targeted by three different companies. Yeah. So like his computers and devices have been maybe not infected, but definitely targeted by spies using three different providers over the years. So it's like, at what point is anyone going to do anything about this? That's the big question. And the answer is, I don't know. And I don't even know what's the right solution to stop the proliferation of these kind of tools.
So let's just talk real quickly. I agree with you. I think it's a tricky problem, and it's made trickier, I think, by the fact that governments like gray areas, and they appreciate the existence of gray in the context of arms trafficking and have for generations. And they have that same appreciation, I think, when it comes to the movement of this kind of thing, because these things are often tools for diplomacy. They're often tools for state building and other relationships. But this brings me to kind of another question for Lorenzo, which is, it hasn't just been regulation. There are some lawsuits, most noticeably a lawsuit brought by WhatsApp against NSO. Can you just give us a quick thumbnail of that?
Yeah, that's a great example. So a couple of years ago, WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, obviously, caught one of these operations against hundreds of their customers. And the operation was carried out by NSO Group, which you mentioned a couple of times. It's out of Israel, and they're essentially the global leaders of this industry right now. And that's an interesting case because WhatsApp's lawyers and Facebook lawyers were like, you know what, we're going to sue them on the grounds that they used our servers and our services to attempt to infect users. They sent malware through WhatsApp messages or something like that. And that's, when that came out, I was very surprised because I was like, well, I never thought that could even be a possibility. I don't know how that case is going to end, but I know for sure that NSO is not happy about it regardless, because, they're spending lawyer money, they're spending resources, and it's not really good PR for them. So yeah, I think that case can be a good example for future cases where companies can fight back, and even victims too.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. For years, victims have been trying to challenge some of these companies, and it's hard. Their resource constraints, and it also isn't helped by the fact that in some cases, like a lawyer representing victims of Pegasus got targeted with Pegasus. as well as, with spies in person. So obviously, there's a question about the risks involved in this, and there obviously are big challenges. Dan, I want to talk to you for a second and just ask you, so Wirecard, no good, right? Very bad folks, very bad company, very bad, not nice.
Very bad folks. And also, I just realized there's a truism that all our stories are always related. And while Lorenzo was just talking there, I just remembered Jan Marsalek, who's the guy on the poster behind me. There was a WikiLeaks dump which showed that in 2013, he wrote a reference for hacking team to the Grenada government. And I really don't know much more about it than that. It just this is one of the things that want to find out more about for the book I'm writing. So if anyone knows more about it, please do get in touch. But yeah, so he was involved with those guys and the government of Grenada for some reason back in the day.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd bring that up. I was going to ask you, so do you feel like right now there are meaningful consequences for lawless behavior, like trying to hire hackers to target journalists, from your perspective? You're a target. You saw a lot of other people targeted.
I mean, I'm still hoping that there will be some consequences for this. I mean, because much of it is wildly illegal, certainly hacking aspects of it. And so, I mean, the approach we've taken, for things like the surveillance is to try where we can to call out the firms who are involved in the surveillance, and also, in Wirecard's case, to call out the various law firms and consultants and people who were working with it. But you kind of would hope that the authorities might take notice of some of this at some point and take some action. And certainly I know that there appears to be some movement on that front. I think was reported in terms of the whole Beltrox hacking. So it seems like they're taking interest in that. But until you get some sort of consequences for any of these firms, and in particular, I think the law firms as well, because what we haven't talked about is the structure of how this happens. So if you are Jan Marsalek, or, let's say you're Mr. Evil at Evil Core, sitting there, you don't just pick up the phone and go, get me the hackers. You pick up the phone to your lawyers, or you maybe even go to their offices and you have a privileged conversation where you say, get me the hackers. Or you don't even say, get me the hackers, you talk in general, how about you'd like to know them more. And the lawyers act as this sort of cutout, and then they talk to the private detectives, and then the private detectives, on their own initiative or whatever basis, go and hire the hackers. And so unless there are consequences for anybody in that chain, which makes this more expensive or more difficult or makes them think twice about doing it, I mean, I don't see any reason why it would stop.
Yeah, and it does. I mean, I think in the same way that, journalists have needed an education in these things, I think law enforcement needs an education. When we started working on the Beltrox case, which the lab calls Dark Basin, you can read about it, we were blown away by the scale of the targeting, sheer numbers of journalists. I mean, they were like fistfuls of journalists targeted over years. Ditto for any kind of investigator, et cetera. But I think this brings me to another question. So you really can't talk about this area without talking about reporter safety. And I think we keep returning to this, it'll keep coming up because it's a real risk. It has some of the same features as other kinds of higher risk reporting, although there's no danger pay for it yet. I feel like, some things have changed in some newsrooms. Runa was at the New York Times for a while and was working on newsroom security there. I think there's still probably a long way to go in many cases, but what's one thing that newsrooms really ought to be doing that for the most part they aren't right now, Runa, to address this?
If I had to pick one thing, I would say that there ought to be more of a connection and communication between the newsroom and the business side of the company. When reporters physically go to war zones, there is a whole process in which they have the training, they have the insurance, they have the paperwork, they have the helmets and the masks and the vests, and they have everything that they need. And that's taken care of by different portions of the company. So why isn't the same done for investigative work or work that involves an online component? And I think that like this type of work and these types of protections is something that currently you have pockets of reporters within a newsroom that maybe they've done this before, maybe they have a friend of a friend of a friend who sort of have done this, they have run into it, they know who to talk to, they know how to reach John or Lorenzo, and sort of they know how to figure things out. But especially if you work for an established media org, those shouldn't be things that you just have to like ad hoc figure things out along the way. It should really be something that is more of an established process within the media org.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it seems like in the same way that, you know, news organizations recognize that physical security threats, if they didn't make investments, would erode their ability to report. And then started looking at self-care and looking at PTSD and saying, you know, we need to support our people. We're going to give them hostile environment training. There's going to be a psychological component to that, right? This is key. That realization, I think, is still years away for many news organizations. And I love your point about communication. It seems like there's a basic issue that happens in so many of the orgs that I have interacted with who are targets, which is maybe the directors knew that there was a risk based on the work that was going on or a deal that was happening. Maybe the reporters knew that they were working on a risky topic, but their cybersecurity teams and so on had no idea that this was happening. And as a result, both had signal that something terrible was happening, but neither had enough of it to know that it really was happening. Lorenzo, I think you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I think something that came up to me earlier too, like I think for example, the Sony hack in, when was it, 2013 or 14, that was a huge landmark for companies taking care of this kind of stuff, because, you know, they saw a huge corporation become completely, you know, destroyed by government hackers from North Korea. And I know for a fact that like some media companies, like journalism companies, are like, okay, we don't want to be like Sony. But I guess the point that I think you were making too is that, you know, you don't want to be anyone, you know, you don't want to end up in the headlines because that's already too late. You know, that's like when you failed along the way. And you know, sometimes it's not that the journalist or the journalist company has failed, is that, you know, the adversaries are very good. But as Runa was also saying, you know, this needs to be really like from the bottom up and the other way around. Like the whole company needs to know that this can happen and needs to put in place processes and educate all employees that this could happen.
Well, folks, we are almost at time. Any closing thoughts from Lorenzo or Dan, Runa?
It's been fun. I will say that it's been a long time since I saw all of you, and it's been great to get back in touch.
Yeah, this was great.
Yeah, folks, thank you for participating in this conversation. I really appreciate all the perspectives that were brought here, and for you, the person, you know, sitting in your home like the rest of us, watching this thing. Thank you for giving us the precious time of your attention between domestic tasks and whatever else you were up to. And I just want to have you walk away, if you can, just with one point, which is what you've heard from each of these people in different ways is that there's a growing industry. It has proliferated globally, and it is bringing risk to your beat and to you. And it's important to take it seriously. The good news is each of the people on this conversation, Dan McCrum, Lorenzo Franceschi-Bicchierai, did I get that right?
Yeah, close enough.
Close enough, okay. Nice guy. And Runa Sandvik are all easy to follow on Twitter, and are all people who can be contacted if you've got questions. They've each experienced this. I respect them and trust them deeply, and would encourage that you get in touch. If you do think that right now you or your organization has an urgent digital security threat, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. My DMs are open. I'm at JS Railton on Twitter. You can also go to the Citizen Lab website, citizenlab.ca, and get in touch with us. And I just want to thank the organizers for having us and giving us this time. Thanks to everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.